Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Chapter 8, Part 2. So last time, when we ended last, I was asking you about a bunch of questions about what you thought was going on in terms of certain behaviors, and then what was actually going on. So what we're doing right now is we're talking about what that was all about. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about being in a class. So let's pretend that this is you right here. And your teacher, your instructor, has been talking and talking and talking. Oh, Kurt Levine's field theory is a function of the behavior by the situation. And you're like, I have no idea what's been going on. You don't know what's happening. And the teacher stops and says, does anybody have any questions? Now, in your brain, you're like, I'm confused. But then you look around and you're like, no one else is raising their hand. I have no idea what this guy's been talking about for the last 40 minutes. And now he's asking for questions, but nobody else is raising their hand, so I'm going to keep my hand down. In reality, well, first of all, this is an example of pluralistic ignorance, which we're going to discuss some more in just a minute. So you are sitting there saying, gosh, I have a question, but nobody else seems to have a question, so I'm not going to raise my hand. When in reality, everybody in that class is exactly the same way. They're all like, I don't know what's going on, but nobody else is raising their hand, so I'm going to keep my hands down. And the poor teacher is there going, hey, I must be a great teacher because nobody has any questions about what's been happening. Pluralistic ignorance is when you think you are different from the group, but you're not. So the ignorance part is, I think that I'm the only one with questions, right? I think that I'm the only one who's actually having questions here. But in reality, that's not true. The pluralistic part is that everybody is feeling that way, or at least lots of people, a plurality of people are feeling that way. So I know I have questions, but I think I'm the only one because no one else is raising their hand. That's the ignorance part. Okay. I think I'm different when I'm not. It's pluralistic when lots of other people feel the same way. Now, what does this have to do with the alcohol hookup and drug behavior questions that we looked at? So when I was still at the University of Maryland, I've done this for years. We've asked those same questions. And so in a big lecture hall, this exact lecture hall, in fact, I asked those questions and we did it by clicker. So we just didn't show people what the responses were immediately. We asked them how many alcoholic beverages they drank within the last week, how many hookups they had within the last month, and how many times have they used illegal drugs within the last year. And here's what we found. So, sorry, we asked them for yourself, right? How many have you had or done or whatever? How many of your classmates, meaning the people in that room, had done? And then what they thought the average was for the University of Maryland student, the average University of Maryland student. Okay, so this is assumptions. So these are the means that we found when we asked this question. When we asked this question for how many drinks per week, this is what people assume the average University of Maryland student is doing. They assume a little over 5 alcoholic beverages a week. They assume like 3.5 hookups per month. They assume 6 or more instances of illegal drug use per year. When you ask the assumption for the class, it goes down a little bit, right? It goes down a little bit. But look at this. This is what was really going on. Now, some people might say, oh, well, you know, the average terp, they might think the terrapins, right? So the average University of Maryland student, that's kind of weird. They might not know who you're actually talking about. That's why we asked what you assume was happening in the class. And literally we said, look at the people around here. And by the way, these are the averages. These are the averages. The most common answers, like for example, the most common answer for how many hookups have you had in the last month is 0. There's a few people driving up that average, right? These often the averages are higher than the mode, which is the most common answer, right? But these are examples of ignorance. Now, this is the sex and relationships chapter, so we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of hookups. Remember, we defined a hookup as a sexual experience without the expectation of a continued romantic relationship. right? And people assume that everyone else, like the people they can see, are doing twice as much. They're having twice as many hookups as they actually are. Twice as many. Twice as many. This is pluralistic ignorance. So the idea is, hey, I'm not having very many hookups, and I must be different from everybody else because, I hear, college students are hooking up all the time. But the thing about it is it's pluralistic because lots of people in that room felt the same way. They felt that everyone else was having more hookups than them, and they were wrong about that. A lot of the literature on pluralistic ignorance has to do with things like binge drinking behavior. People assume that people are binge drinking more than they actually are, but it also includes things like hookups, includes things like academic dishonesty and stuff like that. We assume that other people are doing more than they actually are. Well, so what? So what if each person thinks that everybody else is having more hookups than they actually are? Who really cares about that? Well, first, before we do that, I want to ask, have you experienced pluralistic ignorance in your life? On any topic, whether it's hookups, alcoholic behaviors, whatever it is, have you experienced it? Almost certainly you have. Almost certainly you have done this. Almost certainly you have. It is super, super common. Very, very common for you to do. So who cares? Who cares? What's wrong with feeling unique? All right, so this is you, okay? You feel like you're different than everybody else because, last Friday night, you just sat around studying and, fell asleep with the textbook on your face. That was you. You think that everybody else was getting drunk and having sex, right? They were getting drunk and they were having hookups. That's what you assumed everybody else was doing. Okay? Now, this could very well be pluralistic ignorance because a lot of people are feeling that way. They say, oh man, I'm the only one who is not hooking up with people. No, why would this happen? So first of all, let's talk about why this might happen, and then we'll talk about the consequences. Why might you think that you are the only one not hooking up? Well, one of the reasons why you might think that is because people don't tend to talk about not hooking up, right? They tend to talk about hooking up. So people don't normally go around saying, hey, guess what? Absolutely nothing happened last weekend. Yep, nothing at all. No, you tend to hear the opposite. And so people are more likely to talk about hooking up with someone than they are about not hooking up with someone, right? In the same way, they're going to say, oh man, I got super smashed. People don't tend to go around saying, hey, I was stone cold sober. Hey, been sober a whole week. People don't normally do that. They don't normally do that. And so when you hear these so often, you're like, oh, gosh, I was sober last week. These guys are all getting drunk. Man, I must be weird. Or they're talking about how they hooked up with people last time. Gosh, I must be strange because I didn't at all. You don't talk about the times when you didn't hook up. You talk about the times when you did. At least you hear about them. And so it makes you feel different, right? It makes you feel like you are not normal. When in reality, the majority of the people probably did not have a hookup within the last week. That is most likely the case where you are at. Well, so here, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that there's two big consequences of pluralistic ignorance. And one of them is feeling alienated, feeling different, feeling strange, feeling like you don't belong. So if you didn't have a hookup, you might say, gosh, maybe I'm not a really good college student because, I'm not hooking up with people. When in reality, it's much more common to not hook up with people than it is to hook up with people. That can make you feel alienated when you are in reality much more normal. The other is assimilation. So you're like, gosh, I must be different. Oh, I know. I'm going to go and do these things. Well, we know that there are negative potential consequences for things like binge drinking, but also for things like hookups. Now, why do I say that? Well, I know we say that because there's studies that have found that up to like 50% of sexual experiences on college campuses happen without any kind of contraception or protection, and that can lead to increased rates of infection and other things like pregnancy that can have severe impacts on people's lives, and unfortunately is often negative at that time in their life. So that's why we care. When you feel different from the group, you may feel like you're alienated, like you don't belong, or you feel like you want to assimilate the real problem here is that these are not real norms. These are not actually what's actually happening. You just think they are. And when lots of people think they're happening, it becomes problematic for everyone. Okay, let's move on to ideas of sexuality. So I want you to tell me, what do you consider yourself to be? So what we are discussing here is the idea of sexual orientation. So heterosexual means that you're attracted to, so a male would be attracted to a female, right? A man would be attracted to a woman, etc. Homosexual would be a man attracted to a man. Bisexual, either man or woman. And then there's others as well, right? And there's others that don't quite fit into heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. When we look at rates of people who identify as not heterosexual, that depending on which survey you look at, but it depends on what survey you look at, but the rates of people who do not consider themselves to be heterosexual tend to be around 5% of a population. This is information from the Williams Institute from UCLA, which does a lot of information about lesbian and gay issues. But about 95% of the population tends to consider themselves to be heterosexual. So when we talk about ideas of sexual orientation, there's other concepts that sometimes get confounded with ideas of sexual orientation. So let's talk about ideas of first, sex versus gender. Now we mentioned this in the past, but sex is your physiological sex, right? So the fact of me having an XY chromosome, that indicates my sex is male, right? Versus someone who has an XX chromosome would indicate that they're female. That also includes genitalia and other physical manifestations. Now that's different from gender. Psychology in general will define gender as separate from sex. That is, that you identify with the cultural representation associated with your sex. When you do identify with the cultural representation that is aligned with your sex, you're what we call cisgender, C-I-S, cisgender. So somebody who is cis or cisgender is like, for example, myself, I am male and identify as a man. That's as opposed to someone who would identify as transgender. That's somebody who has a sex of male and then identifies as a woman. Okay, so the terms things like male, female tend to be associated with your sex, whereas man, woman tend to be associated with the idea of gender. Now, these are separate concepts from your sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is ideas of attraction and behavior towards in your sexuality. So even defining sexual orientation can be quite difficult. It tends to have three factors that are important when you identify your sexual orientation. Those include attraction, right? But it also includes behavior and identity. So for example, it is much more common for people to have had a homosexual behavior or experience than it is for them to have actually identified as homosexual, right? Those can be quite different from each other. When you talk about LGBTQIA, those kind of things, lesbian, gay, bisexual refers to orientation, right? Sexual orientation, which is quite different than transgender, which refers to somebody's gender. So that's LGBT. Q often stands for queer or questioning, but queer tends to not fit within even a heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual, or you could be gender queer as well, which doesn't, fit within the established or the traditional categories. I often stands for intersex, which is somebody who may have both male and female reproductive organs or genetics. And I stands for either ally or asexual. So someone who does not particularly feel a sexual attraction at all might be considered asexual, for example. Now, those terms, sometimes there's other letters that are involved and sometimes they're used differently, but those are common, LGBTQI and A. Make sure you know the difference between ideas of gender and sex, and that sexual orientation is quite different from the ideas of identity in gender. Answer this question for me. Let's talk about loneliness. And the reason why we're going to talk about loneliness is because when people are in young adulthood, and most people in college are in their young adult years, then we tend to have a lot of experience with this concept of loneliness. In fact, some studies have found that young adults, people in their early adult years, like 18 to 25-ish, tend to be the most lonely in the United States. So first of all, when we say loneliness, what do we mean? When we say loneliness, we are talking about that feeling, that disjunct between what you want in your social relationships and what you actually have. So somebody could have an expectation of social relationships that's quite high and be lonely because, you know, I expect this, but all I got is that. So you could have a lot of relationships and still be lonely. Whereas somebody might have much lower standards, not have very many social relationships, and not be lonely at all because there are differences in expectations. Young adults in the United States tend to be quite lonely for a couple of reasons. Now, one reason is because often young adults are moving to new places to go to college or to start jobs, etc., and they will tend to lose relationships that they care about, either family or friendship relationships. Also, in young adult years, people tend to be more likely to be looking for one romantic partner than in the past. And so this can lead to ideas of longing and lack of social relationships based off of that time of life. There's also gender differences, though. It turns out that there's evidence that single males are more likely to be lonely than single females, especially in young adult years. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that when we actually look at ratings of loneliness, self-reported ratings of loneliness, males tend to report themselves being more lonely than females, especially if they do not have a romantic relationship. So the single part is quite important. Now, why might that be? Well, this also goes to ideas of culture. So at least in the United States, it is much more rare for a male to have a very close same-sex friend. Friends help provide belonging and help diminish loneliness. And if you're a single male, and males tend to not have close friends who are of the same sex, and those friendships tend to be focused more around activities than they do about like emotional sharing and caring, then you're not as likely to have your emotional needs being fulfilled. Whereas single females often have other female friends who are much more likely to be emotionally involved and provide emotional support than do male friends. The ironic part about this is that lonely males tend to be rated as more negative than lonely females. Now, what do I mean by that? So here's how this goes. What you would do is you give a description of somebody to be rated, right? So you say, all right, let me tell you about John. John is a transfer student who just moved here, who is a psychology major and enjoys his classes but feels really lonely. And then you give the same information, but instead of John, it's Jane. Jane is a transfer student who just moved here, psychology major, enjoys her classes but is feeling really lonely. When you say, how much do you like John, or how much do you like Jane, even though the information is exactly the same except for the gender of the person it's about, what you find is that people rate John as much more negative than Jane. There's a cultural understanding that men are not supposed to be lonely, when in reality, men are more likely to be lonely. Even though loneliness is quite common, young adults tend to have very large social networks. So you have a lot of, I don't know, followers on Instagram, followers on TikTok. Some of you still use Facebook. Maybe you have friends there. I better not guess what technology we're talking about nowadays. But you tend to have a large social network, but still can feel lonely. Now, how can that be? Well, just having a large social network doesn't mean that you're not going to feel lonely. Loneliness tends to be more centered around belonging and the idea of a need to belong. So in psychology, we talk about the need to belong. And that belonging tends to happen from people who you're quite close to. Normally, that's family and close friends. About 12 people, the people you're really close to. Those are the people who provide belonging, right? Somebody who happens to follow me on Instagram probably is not particularly close to me, but is part of my social network. It makes sense, though, that young adults would have large social networks because what tends to happen in young adulthood is you're establishing your own identity and your adult identity and looking for close relationships. So what happens is you start with a broad spectrum of people and then kind of whittle down the ones that are most important to you. Let's talk about disorders. Now, so far we haven't really talked very much about disorders. That's coming up. But you should know that there is a book called the DSM-5, which has a list of all mental disorders. So let's go through some ideas of sexual disorders as defined by the DSM-5. There is a category of sexual disorder called the paraphilias. This includes things like fetishes. Para means beyond or outside. Philia means love. So in this case, these are disorders which are considered disorders because people have sexual arousal due to objects or situations which do not traditionally or normally create the sexual arousal. So for example, a fetish, when you say somebody has a fetish, fetish means that that somebody actually derives sexual arousal from an inanimate object or a part of the body that generally does not create sexual arousal in people, right? So a non-human object, that includes parts of the body like feet or perhaps shoes or clothing. And this literally creates sexual arousal. Another paraphilia is masochism. So if you ever called somebody a masochist, what you're saying is that that person derives sexual pleasure from experiencing physical pain. A sadist, or somebody who is experiencing sadism, is someone who derives sexual pleasure, like actual sexual arousal, from the physical pain or suffering of another person. So know that those are actual disorders. You probably shouldn't be just glibly calling somebody a sadist or a masochist, because those have real behavioral implications. So exhibitionism or voyeurism. These are when people derive sexual pleasure from just watching other people in non-condoned settings and derive sexual pleasure from watching other people. So exhibitionism, traditionally when people call themselves a flasher, for example, that is, they derive sexual pleasure from showing normally their genitalia to somebody else without that person's consent, right? Voyeurism is by watching somebody else without that person's consent. Frauderism is a strange one. Frauderism is when people derive sexual pleasure by rubbing their genitalia against somebody without that person's consent. So, for example, a frauderist might be in a public place, come up to someone and rub themselves against them, and then run away. That's frauderism. Pedophilia is what you think it is. It's driving sexual arousal from children. All right. So that's one classification of sexual disorders. Another one is arousal disorders. Arousal disorders means that there's disorders on not becoming sexually aroused in I guess a normal way. Hypo versus hyper. Hypo means less, hyper means more. So hyposexual disorders mean that you have a disorder where you do not become aroused. You have less sexual arousal in a situation that generally causes sexual arousal in people. Hypersexual sexual disorders mean that you derive more sexual arousal. You have more sexual arousal than people in similar disorders. And dyspareunia is when people experience actual physical pain during a time of penetration and sex. So this is not pain due to pain being inflicted, but psychological pain when pain should not be happening, right? So it's an actual experience of physical pain, even in a sexual situation when pain would not be expected. So these are things that can be diagnosed as a disorder, and we're going to talk more about disorders at a different time. And I think that is the end of this particular one. Oh, we need to talk about one last thing. Oh, how do you make your relationships better? Now, in the reading, there's lots of different ways that this can happen, but let me give you one example. So one thing that often happens is that we have fights, even with people that we care most about, and this creates a lot of concern or problems within a relationship. One way to discuss things without getting it into a fight is by using something called an XYZ statement. An XYZ statement is a combination of a behavior statement with a I statement. So I want you to guess what the Y in XYZ state it represents, and then we'll talk about it. The Y represents the situation. So an XYZ statement is when you're bringing up something that you dislike or want to talk about with your relationship partner. So generally it's a complaint. So for example, let's say that I was angry with my wife because she pulled off all the covers this morning. Okay? Well, one way that I could say that is by saying, you're so selfish. You just think about yourself. All you do is you pull up the covers like every night, and I can't believe you do that. That is one option. That's probably not a good option. One of the reasons why is because I'm accusing her. I'm saying, you always do this. You're this way, and I'm very accusatory. People tend to be quite defensive when you start attacking their self-concept and how they think about themselves. An XYZ statement tries to keep things objective. It says, when you did X in situation Y, I felt Z. Now, notice how I'm not saying you made me feel this thing. You're saying I felt this way. The idea here is you're trying to keep things as objective as possible. So instead of saying you're always so selfish because you just steal the covers every night, instead of saying that, I would say, when you stole the covers last night, I felt disappointed. Okay? The reason why an XYZ statement works better than accusing somebody of something is you're saying, all right, when you did X in situation Y, and that lets my wife or whoever it is say, all right, did I actually steal the covers? Oh yeah, last night I did. I did steal the covers. Objectively, that is a true thing, a true behavior. The I felt is also objective. Now, whether or not you think I should have felt disappointed or anything, I felt disappointed is a true fact. It's an objective truth. I felt that way. And what this allows you to do is to talk about the feelings that are associated with a specific behavior, and allows it to keep much more objective and less accusatory and get into what we would normally consider a fight. Okay, I think that's a good place to stop. We will talk to you next time.